Well, good afternoon. We're delighted to have you all here, you history buffs and you militarists, because we call this the battlefields of the suburban civil wars, Friendship Heights. As mentioned, I will talk about that just in a minute, but as mentioned, I was planning director from 1969 to 1990. So I do have some personal memories of events that transpired during this period of time, but my role today is not to express my opinions, but to elicit the memories of some of the important people who, in the community, who lived through this history. And these are these ladies and gentlemen that I have here on my right. So today we have a wonderful opportunity to travel back in time and hear the personal reflections of four key players in and healthy survivors of the land use battle of Friendship Heights. And each has a wonderful perspective to share with us about what they remember happening during the different phases of what turned out to be a rather long period of land use development around an early incorporated residential area called the village of Friendship Heights. And there's a map on the screen above us which is diagrammatic of the area. And I will introduce my colleagues in just a moment. Our use of the term battlefields and wars is obviously a little hyperbolic, just a little lighthearted effort to attract your attention. No one was physically wounded or killed in what we are calling the suburban civil wars. All the differences of opinion that existed up to that time have been peacefully resolved through the political and legal process, although sometimes it was excruciatingly lengthy and more than fun at some points. But almost every major development site in the last 60 years in the county has had a story behind it of a tug of war between different views of how change should or should not occur. And you heard Royce Hanson this morning metaphorically characterize these two different views as a Hamiltonian commercial republic and a Jeffersonian civic republic. We will see in this presentation, I think, a microcosm of those two force ideas that Royce was illuminating and how it plays out in this particular battlefield. There is the possibility within this metaphor there of future panel examinations in future historic conferences of this kind to look at other battlefield sites in the county, and we'll see whether or not that might be something to do another day. What follows is the story of one such site that played a significant role in the evolution of the planning process in Montgomery County. Royce mentioned that this morning, and we're going to now look at this in some detail. Not by, might say, in every excruciating detail of this, because that would be occupy you here for about, I think we had about a 2-hour lunch just socializing our group here as to what we all remembered. So you would be in for a whole day at least if we were trying to cover all of it. So this is going to be a compression, and it's going to be reflected through the lenses of what four of these key people remember. The story starts around 1970 and evolves over 30 years up to about 2000. It is told today in two phases, focused first around the adoption of a first master plan in 1974, and second around the adoption of an update of that plan in 1998. And to orient you to the geography, you have the map that I've sketched up on the screen above us. Now, the different benchmarked areas are the intersection of Wisconsin Avenue and Western Avenue is the focal point of this area. Chevy Chase Land Company Shopping Center was on the northeast to the right there, and the Woody's department store was on the other corner. This is a map as it was in, let's say, 1965 or whatever. To the left of the Woody's department store show on site, there is a rectangle in black that I forgot to identify. That is the Geico property. That is an office building that came in that will be mentioned. So that's where that is. It doesn't have a name on it, but that's the Geico property. To the left of that is a residential area called Brookdale. And to the north of that is Friendship Heights, is that triangular area. And to north of that is a residential community called Somerset. And there is a tract there called the Bergdahl Tract that initially was all covered with trees and now has 3 big towers called Somerset House. And then to the other side of the Wisconsin Avenue is Chevy Chase residential area, and north of that is the Chevy Chase Golf Course. And I think that's the major components of our areas. I mention this because just like the terrain at Gettysburg, the lay of the land makes a difference to the way that everybody came to engage. Now let me introduce our honored guests, to whom we at the Historical Society are very grateful for their generous donation of time to prepare for this discussion. So in sequence of speaking, they are Julie Davis on my right, who is initially a resident of Chevy Chase Village. That's the area to the northeast of the intersection of Wisconsin and Western. Julie is a tax attorney who's also been involved in Montgomery County planning and zoning issues since the early 70s, when she lived in Chevy Chase Village and joined the Citizens Coordinating Committee on Friendship Heights. She was appointed by the Planning Board to represent her community as a member of the Citizen Advisory Committees for both the 1974 and the 1998 sector plans. She has also served on a number of other Planning Board committees, including the Zoning Advisory Panel that worked with the board and its staff on the recent 3-year rewrite of the Montgomery County Zoning Code. To Julie's right is Norman Knopf, who was initially a resident of Brookdale, which you see to the left of the intersection. Norman is an attorney whose principal area of practice is land use planning and zoning. In 1969, he moved into the Brookdale community, located adjacent to Friendship Heights, as you see, and he has recently moved back into a condominium in Friendship Heights itself. So we have some, also, by the way, Julie is also living in Somerset House. So we have 2 of the original single-family residential leaders of the perspective they brought, now having other events in life and have moved back in and are resident in the community again. Let's see. In the early 1970s, Norman founded and was the first chair of the Citizens Coordinating Committee on Friendship Heights, which is an umbrella group of civic organizations that he formed to make the views of the area residents heard in the planning and development process. He remains active in this organization. On Norman's right is ALFRED MULLER, a resident of the Friendship Heights Village itself, which is the epicenter of the issues that swirled around this area. And ALFRED is a medical doctor, educated at Princeton and Columbia universities with 30 years experience in the practice of internal medicine. In 1973, he moved to Friendship Heights and quickly was elected chair of the council of this small residential community that enjoyed a degree of self-government, being granted a special taxing district within the state of Maryland. They didn't have zoning powers, but they did have some local government powers. Dr. Muller has been a key participant in the evolution of this community, having served initially as chair and subsequently as mayor from 1973 all the way through to 2001. And finally, and not least but not last, I just mixed that up for you, Steve, is the attorney for the developer of the Woody's site on the west side of the intersection. Stephen Robbins is a land use attorney at Lurch, Early, and Brewer in Bethesda, one of our prominent legal firms in the county, who represents prominent national and regional developers, contractors, lenders, and commercial property owners, and has been involved in many high visibility projects in Montgomery County. In addition to his activities in project coordination, legal education, public affairs participation, and pro bono housing, Steve was the principal representative for the developer of Wisconsin Place, which is now a large mixed-use development with a variety of complex components that was successfully implemented at the intersection of Wisconsin and Western Avenue. So we have 4 key players in the evolution of this battle, as we're characterizing it. And each of our speakers will have about 10 minutes to share their memories with us. I will signal each at the halfway mark with a 5 and a 2-minute mark, so we can try to leave a little time for questions and answers from the audience at the conclusion. So we're going to begin with Julie and then Norman outlining the events of the period dominating by the first phase, which oriented around the 1974 master plan. And I will show you.
We're here today because presumably we're all interested in history. Dick was kind enough to give you some of the background on my professional history and a little bit about my historical involvement in Montgomery County planning and zoning matters. But before I get started with the history of Friendship Heights, I'll just share with you a little bit of a personal history. I'm one of those rare birds who was born and raised in the D.C. area, lived both in Montgomery County initially and then in Chevy Chase, D.C. I spent my youth riding a bicycle to the Giant at the Chevy Chase Center with my mother's store list because we lived in the Friendship Heights, Chevy Chase area. My brother worked at the hardware store after school and on weekends, McIntyre's for any of you who go back that far. My mother and I were two of the first people in the front door of Woody's the day it opened in 1952. She was not to be stopped. And of course, I had to come with her. And for that, I still have a little demi-tasse spoon with the Woody's building on top of it. Later, I would walk from our house, which was right around Chevy Chase Circle on the DC side, down to the Friendship Heights bus station where I would take the streetcar to my high school at Tenley Circle. So I have been around Friendship Heights for years and years and years. What I never expected when I grew up, of course I was never going to live in Washington, much less in Chevy Chase, DC or Maryland, but found myself in the middle of, as Richard likes to call it, the Great Friendship Heights Civil Wars. My job today is to give you a little bit of the background before we got to the actual planning stage. In the late 50s, early 60s, it had become apparent that we were going to have a mass transit system in the Washington area. Plans were afoot to both plan the routes of the system, which you are now very familiar with, all the different colored lines, but more importantly for planning and zoning purposes, where the stations throughout the metro system were going to be located. By the early 60s, it was clear that Montgomery County would have its share of stations, and the 4 stations that were going to open the earliest and were going to be the center of what was assumed to be significantly great commercial and residential development around those stations were Friendship Heights, Silver Spring, Wheaton, and Bethesda. Planning began in the county for development around those stations because it was assumed the costs of metro were going to be so great that the increased commercial and residential development, the taxes from that development, both business and income, would help defray the costs of building the system. With respect to Friendship Heights, everyone knew it was planned to be the first statement that would be online. Not surprisingly, this attracted the attention of local developers and some national developers, and they began to make plans for the Friendship Heights Central Business District. In Friendship Heights itself, in the village of Friendship Heights, lived Thelma Edwards, known as Tim Edwards, and Milton Barlow, who were instrumental in assembling large parcels of land within the village for future development. Tim was a local real estate agent, and Milton Barlow was a developer in that area. They assembled and with their neighbors, because they were both residents within Friendship Heights, living in single-family homes. Friendship Heights itself, back in the day, as you can see from this photograph, all of those trees to the north of the Woody site, that was all single-family. Old, in many cases, Victorian homes that had been there since the turn of the century. There had been 2 farms in the Friendship Heights area, 2 principal farms. They gradually had been subdivided into single-family homes. Timmy Edwards, as we all called her, and Milton Barlow were residents, and they managed to convince, and I don't think it was a hard job, many of their neighbors to enter into contracts to assemble the land in the area for future development. That assembly began, and that led to, within fairly close order, the construction of the initial large buildings in Friendship Heights that lined Wisconsin Avenue, starting, if you know the area, from what we know as the Barlow Building, which is down by Wisconsin Circle, up to and including across from Saks, but on the west side of the street. It led to the construction of the very large residential high-rise buildings behind the commercial buildings in the village of Friendship Heights itself. The developers were aided in this effort by the then Montgomery County Council from 1962 to 1966, who rezoned all that property to, and I won't get too technical about zoning, but it was a zone that allowed the heights up to 14 stories, which were more or less unheard of in that day, lot line to lot line, great big buildings, and that's to this day what those buildings remain in Friendship Heights. Meanwhile, other developers were circling the area with great interest, and they engaged and paid a prominent Washington architectural firm, Blastmill Kubek and Associates, to put together a development plan for actually both sides of Friendship Heights. Although we in Montgomery County are more familiar with our side, the Friendship Heights area, Central Business District, was going to include the other side of Western Avenue in D.C. down to where Jennifer Street, Lord and Taylor's in that development now is. Mazza Galleria was on the D.C. side. The Mazzas were involved in this, and the owners of all that property along Wisconsin Avenue down to Jennifer Street. Mr. Kubek, architect Kubek, put together what became known as the Kubek Plan for Friendship Heights, and it was a doozy. The Kubek Plan for Friendship Heights, that was the scale of the buildings they were anticipating, running roughly from Saks Fifth Avenue, which by then had been built and open for about 10 years, had to the north and down to and including across Western Avenue and down to and including Jennifer Street to the south. The scope of the Kubek Plan, when all was said and done and the square feet were counted, was of a intensity equal to 4 Crystal Cities of that day and 2 Roslins. It was unbelievable. It was unveiled to the public in October of 1971 in the Geico Auditorium. Community representatives were there. The hosts were the National Capital Planning Commission and the Montgomery County Planning Board. But there were representatives from the community that saw the Kubek Plan in all its glory. And if anybody wants to look after this talk concludes, some of us still have our 40-year-old crumbling Kubek plans that we get out every once in a while to tell ourselves how bad it could have been. In any event, Norman was there at Geico in October of 1971 as president of the then Brookdale Citizens Association, and he will continue this with what went on from there with the civic groups.
I guess I'm a newcomer because I didn't move into Brookdale till 1969, way after Julie was already there. To understand fully the, quote, civil wars, let me just back up a second. We moved into Brookdale because it had all the characteristics of what everybody loved about Montgomery County. Nice single-family homes on tree-lined streets, quiet, pleasant. It was a lovely suburban area. This is why people came to Montgomery County. This is why we were all so happy, and Montgomery County had such a good reputation. So, lo and behold, we were surprised to learn of the Kubek Plan, and that came out of the blue. Needless to say, it was not given rave reviews by the community. The Kubek Plan anticipated such high rises and such a degree of development all around in the Friendship Heights area, which was surrounded by communities like Brookdale, as Dick mentioned. Somerset was to the north, Chevy Chase Village was to the east. All these lovely, quiet, single-family home communities suddenly anticipated an influx of cut-through traffic, parkers, high-rise buildings looming over the neighborhoods. So people turned out in rather large numbers. The Geico hearing, where there was a presentation of the plan, brought out so many people, including young parents with kids that showed up in pajamas because they knew this was going to be a long meeting, and they listened to the presentation, which did not seem to pacify them. Analogies were made to this would be like in Montreal, where they had a metro stop. We were told, don't worry about the traffic, everyone will go by subway. Some people wondered how many people would shop at Neiman Marcus going by subway, so there was a little doubt to this. We looked carefully at the plan and discovered even the planners think might be a traffic problem because they were building a monorail so people could go above the street because no one's going to move on the street. Well, needless to say, people were very upset. So what happened was the citizens organized to collect all the civic associations that were in and around Friendship Heights, including people that lived in Friendship Heights and the high-rises, including those on DC and those in Maryland, and we formed the Citizens Coordinating Committee on Friendship Heights. And that organization was the umbrella group for the civic associations to coordinate the position to be taken and to try to make their voices heard. We were told it would be hard, and it was hard, because the rubric was everybody loves progress, and all the money that will flow from this would be wonderful. And not to worry, all your communities will be fully protected, even though they might have a 14-story building over them, and so on. So they formed the Citizens Coordinating Committee on Friendship Heights, and that committee raised money, organized the communities, and we made our voices heard. They were heard in many ways, and it shows the example of the concern in the community, which was then dubbed the Civil Wars, perhaps, by today. We had so many people turn out at public hearings. We had busfuls of people. They were chartered. We packed the BCC auditorium at a public hearing. We had pickets that circled Woody's because we had that many people that showed up. Parents pushing baby carriages. Julie and I both had, my wife and Julie were pushing baby carriages. We did not want to destroy what we felt was the quality of life in the adjacent neighborhoods. We felt that was what was at stake. And that's where this could be phrased as a civil war between what was existing and what we felt would be totally threatened. We were told it would be a done deal. The developers were used to persuading people that progress was good, persuading the politicians. Our cry was not only not to Quebec plan, but to downzone, lower what was in Friendship Heights already that would be permitted, and to bring about some compatible development with the area. We were not totally successful, but we were quite a bit successful in the sense that the original projections were greatly lowered. Of course, the citizens felt that they got a lot more development than they wanted, and I'm sure the developers felt that they got a lot less than they wanted. Julie will address that. They did feel that way, or we can address it, there was a lot of litigation that pursued after that. To give you some examples of the degree of intensity and the battles that went on, in the Bergdahl tract, which is where Somerset House is currently located, that was within the town of Somerset. And what originally proposed there was a Macy's and a major shopping complex. Then the town battled that for years. The town council paid for lawyers to fight the developers, and the town council concluded they were going bankrupt and they were going to lose, so they reached a settlement with the developers where the developers would give so much land for parkland and the rest would be developed in housing. And the townspeople were very concerned because the number of residents living in the high-rises would outnumber the voters in the town. And they were very concerned. So when the public hearings were held, the town council, the mayor showed up, and said that the town council endorses the rezoning to allow the housing. And that was the official position of the town council. They had signed a settlement agreement, and they agreed to do that. And they so say. Immediately following that testimony was the president of the Somerset Citizens Association, a non-governmental group that had a petition signed by everybody in town except those on the town council that said, no, we're not in favor of it. This was an example of the degree of the intensity of the feeling of the threat of the feeling that it would destroy the quality of life and the type of residential communities that existed. There were rumors which fed this that once Friendship Heights, the Quebec Plan area would be developed, it would then move and develop the Geico property and would then go down to River Road. You know, it's like the camel's nose under the tent, or we used to say, it's like being a little bit pregnant when you do this development. The cry at the time was, they are Manhattanization. They are Manhattanizing Montgomery County, and we didn't need it. The theory was, you have a lot of population coming in, and you have to have a place for that population. You also have the metro, and people want to use it. The problem was, we would say, was that the district, which originally had a population of 800,000, was then down to 500,000, and all the infrastructure was still in place in the district. Why don't people settle there instead of coming and settling in our idyllic neighborhoods? So this was the battle. There was the public policy of trying to facilitate metro use. There's a public policy presumed that you would get more tax revenues from the development, although I haven't noticed my taxes going down lately, even though we have all this development in Montgomery County. And on the other side, there was the feeling that you got a good thing, why are you fiddling with it? And that's the way the Civil War took place. Another way we did this was the planning board had advisory committees, that advisory committee they set up to advise on the plan, and they had citizen representatives. I'm pleased to report that the coordinating committee, unbeknown to the chair, had 7 of the 12 slots on the advisory committee, and we spoke uniformly, and one of our biggest complaints was, what are you going to do with all the traffic? Of those of you that know Friendship Heights, it's essentially 2 streets, Wisconsin and Western. There's not a grid pattern, there's no major highways, and that was going to be a major problem. The planning board, to its credit, did give a lot of weight to the traffic problem. That's in the 70s plan. When you get to the 1998 plan, they give no weight to traffic. It's a metro area, you should expect congestion, which is exactly why back in the 70s, we were concerned with all this development changing our style of life, changing our quality of life, and that's why the feeling was there was this Civil War. The Civil War moved on after the adoption of the plan into the courts, where there were multiple lawsuits, and eventually the plan was upheld. The Citizens Coordinating Committee hired a lawyer to support the county, and that lawyer was paid for by a huge effort by the citizens to raise funds and through house tours, which were conducted in Chevy Chase Village. We charged the public, raised funds that way. We also sold cookbooks, etc. But it was a major community effort confronted with what they felt was a challenge to their way of life. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming, and thank you to Dick Tustian for inviting us. It's like old home week for us. And it's good to see Dr. Royce Hansen here, who sat through the various battles of this Civil War. Friendship Heights, I was privileged to be the mayor for 26 years in the midst of pretty much all these battles. And as you can see from the original slide, Friendship Heights, the village, was right in the middle of it, as I call it, the eye of the storm. During my early years in Friendship Heights, our village had a reputation for being one of the most litigious towns in the country. And that's possibly why we have 3 attorneys on the panel today. One court decision summed it up nicely. It had the memorable phrase, "Friendship Heights is not a place, it's a state of mind." And I think most of us still feel that way. It holds a particular precedent in the county. Friendship Heights was the first sector plan. It was the first central business district. And that was very important, not only for us, but for the county. Going forward, how were they going to manage all these other special designated areas, special central business districts? Well, let me give a quote, since all of you are interested in history. Woodrow Wilson, it's one of our favorite quotes in the village. Woodrow Wilson said, "The history of a nation is the history of its villages written large." Just think about that for a minute. Because what was Friendship Heights? Originally, Friendship Heights was part of a vast tract of land given by the King of England to one individual, and it extended all the way from McLean Gardens up to Rockville. That's the Friendship Tract. Eventually, in the 1800s, a shoemaker family from Pennsylvania, they were Quakers, purchased the area that subsequently became Friendship Heights, and it was 2 farmhouses. And then at the turn of the century, the 19th century, or is it the 20th century? The 20th century, they had, from 2 farmhouses, they began building those Victorian houses that Julie Davis described. And by the time they became a special tax district in 1914, they had just a few of these large Victorian homes. 50 years later, in 1964, Friendship Heights had grown to include a close-knit community. It was a community of single-family homes, just like Chevy Chase, just like Brookdale, of about 105, 108 single-family homes. And then in 1964, the Maryland Park and Planning Commission initiated commercial zoning in Friendship Heights and the vicinity, and that allowed buildings up to 140 feet, and it allowed clever entrepreneurs like Milton Barlow and Tim Edwards to assemble the property and build the first high-rises. So by 1973, when I moved into the village, that old community of 108 single-family homes had been obliterated. It was gone. There are only 5 of those houses left, and only 2 of them had residents. And it had been replaced by a vertical village of almost 3,000 apartment homes, none of whom could really vote, because in those days, property was required in order to be a voter for the local government. And if you think that the emotions have calmed down, let me read you a letter that was written in July of 2015 from one of the descendants of those battles. Quote, "The history of the destruction of the original village is a vile and vulgar tale of unbridled greed. The story of how a small number of completely unscrupulous men and women can gull and cheat their neighbors for their own selfish benefit. Part of that story, of course, will place the doomed village in its setting of county misgovernment by a county council elected by developers, speculators, and zoning lawyers. I still weep for what was lost and for those who were cheated and betrayed." End of quote. Tell us how you really feel. And this is from one of the prime historians in the county, Mr. ALFRED. In 1972, a Baltimore federal court ruled that municipal charters, such as that of Friendship Heights, which was a special tax district, these charters, such as ours, required property ownership as a condition for voting or holding elective office, and this was deemed unconstitutional, violating the 14th Amendment. In response, the Maryland legislature passed and the governor signed on April 26, 1973, a bill giving voting rights to all residents of Friendship Heights to vote in their village elections, which we hold every 2 years, regardless of whether they were renters or property owners. This is important because there were only, by that time, only like a dozen property owners left, but there were 3,000 renters. Well, guess what happened in the election? The tenants won Mrs. Edwards and her allies were defeated, and a new council took office in May of 1973. A new council which was dedicated to balanced growth, and we changed our name from a committee to a village council. And this new council was determined to, as was the coordinating committee, focus on the quality of life rather than just buildings of stone and concrete. So the newly elected representative government turned its attention to creating a new community, and we had to start from scratch. Over the ensuing 26 years, I was privileged to be their mayor, and we implemented a number of innovative, created ideas that would foster community, a monthly newsletter, a shuttle bus service that goes from each high-rise to the Metro, the Whole Foods, and the shopping center. And most importantly, the building of a community center which would serve as the heart of the community and provide weekly lectures, classes, concerts, movies, art exhibits, all of which were covered by the yearly tax. So it essentially was you just come in and you don't have to pay anything. And despite all of these good things being done, the litigation continued until finally, with perseverance, we finally were able to win almost all of the suits, and the village has flourished since then. It is a new, it's vibrant community. It has risen from literally the ashes like a phoenix, but by the 1990s, the sector plan was being reviewed again. And this time, the village worked with the three major property owners, Geico, Chevy Chase Land Company, the Hex site, to see if we could form a consensus where there might be agreement on a philosophy of balanced growth rather than go through another civil war such as we'd had from the 70s and 80s. And I think that's where Steve Robbins picks up.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you for coming today. I'm Steve Robbins. I'm an attorney with the law firm of Lurch, Shirley & Brewer in Bethesda, Maryland. And Dick, thank you for including me in this distinguished panel. I'm the, I guess, the newest comer of everybody here. In 1974, I was just in junior high school at Pyle Junior High over on Wilson Lane while they were messing around with all the litigation and everything else in the 1974 plan in Friendship Heights. But trust me, by 1994, I was definitely considered to be at least one of the major players, along with this distinguished panel here, in changing the landscape of Friendship Heights. So I really didn't get to experience what happened in the 70s and really even in the early 80s in terms of all the fighting and the civil wars and the battlefields, but I was aware of it. So I came on board essentially in early 1994 when the county council was considering re-reviewing the Friendship Heights sector plan. I was about a mid-level associate at a different law firm who represented Woody's department store, but not in really land use matters, although I was working solely on land use and zoning matters in Montgomery County. And I recognized that when the county opened the sector plan, that this was really the opportunity to transform what was the Woody's department store on the map there, the existing Hex, from a department store of about 175,000 square feet, give or take, with a major surface parking lot, which had the benefit of having Metro literally right at its front doorstep. And if you all remember in the early 90s, at that time, Woody's was struggling big time financially. But I went to folks that were involved with Woody's and told them that this effort was about to occur and that they needed to pay attention to what was going on with this particular asset, because in my mind it was not only an incredibly valuable asset for the company, but a very important asset for Montgomery County, literally right on top of the Metro in what was one of the most urbanized areas in the county. As I mentioned, at the time the sector plan started, HEX was about 175,000 square feet, and the 74 plan that these folks worked on allowed HEX to go up the property to have about 475,000 or so square feet, which included the existing HEX store. So there really wasn't much room for much additional development under the 74 plan, although that's probably a matter of disagreement, which was where we started off in the 1994 plan. Because when I came in, we were, through Woody's, seeking to increase the density on the site, given the fact that we were located right on top of the metro. And I had recognized that a lot of prior efforts had failed to redevelop this property. In fact, there was a plan that was actually approved, which would have located another amount of development right at Friendship Boulevard and in Western Avenue, where the project just sat and was never actually developed. So, as I think Al and Norm mentioned, when the 1994 plan started, the major effort was the creation of a Citizens Advisory Committee. And I asked Woody's, can I participate as your representative on that group? And I became involved, and as Norm mentioned, he was involved, Al was involved. Julie was not on the CAC, although she was there a lot, and somehow, yeah, she was sort of on it. But
I was a substitute.
you had representatives from the towns and the villages and everywhere, including the three major property owners, which was HEX, Chevy Chase Land Company, and of course Geico. And at that time, everyone was completely jockeying for positions. It was highly political. The meetings were somewhat contentious, but I think in a sort of a strange way, very friendly as well. And it became very interesting because for me, when Woody's was involved, as we were going on in very short order, Woody's ended up not surviving. And in the 11th hour, the May Department Stores Company came in and took over from Woody's, and I ended up continuing my representation for the May Department Stores Company and sitting on the CAC as well. Woody's, or I should say the May Department Stores Company, as Al mentioned, as we got involved in this debate over the sector plan through the Citizens Advisory Committee, we were focused on how to try to reach some consensus with anybody that wasn't a developer. And the Village of Friendship Heights was also very interested in trying to reach consensus too. So the consensus group was put together, and we call this the consensus group. I think there would be a difference of opinion as to what Julie and Norm might call this group, but it was made up of Geico, Chevy Chase Land Company, the May Company, along with representatives both in the business community and in the civic community from the Village of Friendship Heights. And this really was a critical element of the 1994 plan that ultimately was approved in 1998. And I think it was the first time, at least in my dealings with Friendship Heights, where there was some consensus between at points, very adversarial parties with a very large municipality like the Village of Friendship Heights. And we did move forward with a consensus plan. We actually went before the Planning Board, which the consensus plan proposed significantly greater development than what was proposed by the Planning Board staff. And the Planning Board actually generally agreed with the consensus plan. It didn't end there with the developers and the consensus group. We went up to the county council. That was what, in about 1995 or about 1996, because everything took about a year and a half or 2 years between the planning board, then to the council, because as you can see on this chart, the sector plan was approved in 1998, but we started it in 1994. So there was a lot of work going on the sector plan. The county council had about 9 or 10 work sessions. We had public hearings, and there was a lot of, while there was consensus among the consensus group, the single family dwellers, like Chevy Chase Village and Brookdale, were very much opposed, I would say, to this plan. And frankly, they had a very talented and extremely bright council member, one who I had great respect for that unfortunately passed away, Betty Ann Cronkey, who was very intimately involved in the sector planning efforts and understood the issues. And she was, I think, a great champion for your communities. She ultimately she fought hard, but the council did approve a sector plan that really did add significantly more development in certain areas of Friendship Heights. And I think we were, as the May Department Stores Company, the beneficiary of an increase of about 600,000 or 700,000 square feet greater than what was approved in the 1974 plan, given in large part the fact that we were right on top of a metro station, and we were poised to move forward with a project. Once the sector plan was approved, I think Bill Hussman, a former chair of the planning board, when they were reviewing this plan, he really put his finger on a critical issue here, which was whatever was going to get approved was likely going to be implemented very quickly. It was unusual, but this was very true. When the sector plan was approved, we came out of the gates, meaning the May Department Stores Company came out of the gate very quickly. We joined forces with a developer, New England Development Company, and developed a project known as Wisconsin Place, and I'm going to show you this, that is where is on top of the Hex 8-acre parcel right now. One thing I want to point out with Wisconsin Place and how we worked to really be successful at developing this project was working with the community. This was, you hear about the battles and the civil wars and all that. We worked with the village of Friendship Heights very well during the sector plan. I'm going to go right to number 3. During the sector plan to try to create consensus. And we knew that our single family friends were not so happy with the sector plan, and it was something that we really wanted to work out with them. The key to the success of this development was not only a great client in New England Development out of New England, who had a substantial experience developing large-scale mixed-use projects, but it was also the ability to work together with everybody to try to make something happen. And I'd like to point out at the community center, which is the sort of the pinkish area, right, well, the residential building is the pink area, but right in between the residential and the Hex is a community center. The sector plan asked for about 12,000 square feet of community space. And that's all we really had to provide. We went in on multiple occasions for approvals. And the first approval actually was for about 12 or 15,000 square feet of community space. But there were certain single-family dwellers, and one in particular, Bob Cope, who they're very close with, that was really forging ahead for a full-scale 24 to 26,000 square foot Montgomery County run community center. There was about double the space at a very significant price tag. Early on, we looked at that and we said, you know what, if we can do it, we're going to do it. And that community center, in my opinion, became the linchpin of the development moving forward successfully because we agreed to do it. We ended up developing the community center, which had a full-scale basketball court, had locker rooms, had fitness rooms and everything. And I would say that it's hard to sort of pack this all in 7 to 10 minutes, but I would say that my experience in terms of dealing with Friendship Heights was different because, yes, there was a lot of give and take, and there was a contentious atmosphere for a while. But in the end, not only did we, meaning the Hex site, work out a very positive working relationship with the village of Friendship Heights through the consensus group, which I think was a historical event in its own right. But we then, moving forward with the development process and working with other community members who were not so happy with the sector plan, but I think recognized that if development was going to occur in Friendship Heights, it certainly was going to occur on this site, which was underutilized and right on top of a metro, forging a very positive working relationship with them, which we still have to this date, with a project that started in 1994 and actually just finished in, say, 2010 or 11, was significant in its own right. So for me, it was a very positive situation. It proved that working with the community cannot be understated or overstated, that it's critically important. We met with the community often, and we sought their input and opinions, and I think that's why we were successful, and to this day have a tremendous amount of respect for each other, not only for this project, but also as other projects that we've all worked on together. I've worked with Norm on many different things, and also with Julie. And so my view on Friendship Heights is, yes, while it was contentious and there were certain battles, it was also a very positive experience. Thank you.
Get your question just a minute, but I'm going to just put a little commentary. I love these people. We had a socialization in Julie's around Julie's dining room table, and it was like maybe in 1885 or something. The North and the South guys who fought each other came together and told war stories. It was a lot of fun. But from my vantage point, I would offer, there's three observations that connect maybe back to the larger theme that Royce was doing this morning, which I think Friendship Heights illustrates. First, there were three precedents set in this plan that had a great effect, in the 74 plan, that had a tremendous effect on the future of the planning and the progressive regime that Royce was talking about. First was a legal precedent. The legal precedent of the 74 plan, where you had the clash of opinions between the single-family residential and the development community reflected in the Quebec plan. The legal precedent was set that previously existing zoning could be downzoned. And that in terms of intensity of use, density of bulk, that's what a downzoning is just less stuff on the site, provided that it was supported by a rational explanation of the need for such a reduction that would support a legally valid public purpose. So you have to have a public purpose justifying reducing, because this is constitutionally private property, can't be interfered by the government. So this gets technical. You get into the weeds about zoning stuff and so forth. It's very complicated. I want to congratulate all these people. They started out without being experts, but now they've all become so. Steve went to school and learned about it, but the other three of them have had to come up to speed in the jargon of all of that. So this is a wonderful exposure for lay people to have fun with all this. I hope it was fun. Second major precedent, planning.
Not always so much fun with Norm, but
some more than that.
Thank you for the compliment.
The planning precedent was set that a rationale to support the rezonings, whether it's up or down, should include analysis of the capacity of the public facilities. Royce mentioned this in his talk this morning. This capacity of the public facilities to support the private sector development contemplated by the new zoning, critical key idea that was through the whole period of that progressive regime, and involved us in a lot of modeling to try to assess what is the right proportion of new jobs and new housing to schools, to traffic, to water, to sewer, et cetera. So that's part of Royce's rationale of the justification by the outcomes, which I think was going for a long time. Whether it's still being as applied as it used to be is maybe a question for the future. The third big precedent was the political precedent that was set that the process of developing new master plans should include opportunities for the submission of ideas and other mechanisms of participation by all affected parties. And that, you've heard the story of how that evolved. And originally the residents having little to do in a top-down process, pushing open the door, getting it, and then modifying it back and forth. And my take on, I love the name of this battlefield. With that, I'd like to ask you to thank I thank them very much. Thank you very much.